So now we begin looking at the four different areas of our formation, and today we're going to dive into the intellectual life. The intellectual life is all about the attitudes and beliefs that we uphold, the choices that we make, and it's so important because they affect our relationships. And so today we're going to begin with some pretty fundamental philosophical terminology. If you don't get it at first, don't be discouraged. It takes time. But these things will later play itself out in the other pillars of formation, and you'll see very clearly why they're important. Today what I'd like to introduce us to is the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle speaks about nature, and it's very important as Catholics that we reflect on nature. In order for grace to be built in our life, it has to build off what we already are. And so when we look to the philosophers for wisdom about what nature is and what it means to be a human being, we look first to Aristotle and Plato. They were two great Greek philosophers that really got the ball rolling on how to figure out wisdom. And what's amazing about them was none of them were Christian, and yet the church listens to what they're saying and believes that they have something good to add to us. And that's, after all, a Catholic approach to truth. It doesn't matter what the source of the truth is from human beings. If it's true, it's part of our faith. And so with Aristotle and Plato, they teach us about things like the soul, our relationship to truth, which we might call the logos. And all of it is fulfilled in Christ. In many ways, these philosophers point towards Christ in a way we could never have imagined before Christ himself appeared to us. Today, as I mentioned, I'd like to reflect on the importance of nature. Because if we want to understand our relationship with one another and the world that we live in today, we need to dive into what it exactly means to have a nature and to live in this world. First of all, I'd like to reflect on what's called the four causes of Aristotle. Four causes has a connotation of the four reasons why. And so, why does the universe exist? Why is nature the way it is? And so Aristotle says there's four reasons why nature is the way it is, and he breaks it down into these categories. The first is pretty understandable. We relate to it very well. The first is called material cause. Everything is made out of something physical and material in the visible universe. So take a chair, for instance. The one I'm currently looking at that you can't see is made out of plastic and metal. And so that's the material cause of this chair. When we look at it and ask, why does it exist? Part of the answer is that it's made up of matter, and a type of matter, plastic and metal. The second is called the agent cause, sometimes referred to as the efficient cause. Both of those mean the same thing. The agent cause might be better described as something like a carpenter. And so what's the forces or force that put together this chair and formed it into the shape that it has now? That is the agent cause. So probably an assembly line or factory created this chair, and that would be the agent cause. The third cause is a little bit more abstract. It's called the formal cause. Another word for it might be the essence of a thing. And so what makes a chair, and what makes that chair different than a desk? And we'd say it's the form of it. Now, we can't understand form to be a material reality, but rather it's what's applied to the material reality. And so sometimes we know that when a statue is being made, it's carving away the excess of the marble, or shaping, of course, clay into the form of something else. And so the form of matter is incredibly important, and this is true all the way at the subatomic level. We know that with atoms and quarks and electrons and positrons, neurons, waves, so on and so forth, there are ways to distinguish between one and the other. And what allows us to distinguish between one or the other is the fact that each one has its own form. Another word for form, according to Pope Benedict and Plato, might be something like intelligibility. What makes a thing what it is and different from something else? Without form, we would not be able to tell the difference between a chair and a desk. Matter would be, in this incomprehensible way, understood. It would have no form. Well, what would that look like? It wouldn't look like anything. And so Aristotle says that matter cannot exist without form, that the two have to go together, with one exception, which we might possibly talk about later. The fourth cause is final cause. We might sometimes translate this into purpose or design. Why do we use the word final? Well, final has the connotation of its end or its ultimate purpose, what it's moving towards accomplishing. It's trying to fulfill a potential to become fully what it's supposed to be. So if we look at the final cause of a chair, it hasn't reached its fulfillment until someone's sat in it. The purpose of that chair is for my butt. We know that this actually applies to nature as well. So far I've just been talking about what human beings create, but Aristotle went even a step further and said we can witness and understand that there is purpose within nature. So for example, when we look at the human body and the anatomy that exists within us, we notice that we have eyes and ears. We don't determine for ourselves what those eyes and those ears are for. Rather, we humbly discover them. I don't wake up in the morning and say, today I've decided my eyes are going to be for seeing. Rather, we know that eyes are just made to see. And so the purpose of my eyes is to see, the purpose of my ears is to hear. The purpose of my teeth is to crush food and help me digest it. The purpose of my tongue enables me to speak, of course to swallow, and so on and so forth. And so we know that there are components of our body that are made in such a way that they are for a certain purpose. Now, if you look at the word design, it's very helpful because another word that's rooted in design is designation. So designation doesn't necessarily mean that there's a designer, it implies that. But designation means that it has a certain end. What Aristotle noticed was, bracketing the question of whether there's an intelligence behind all of these designations, is that things move towards a specific end in nature and in what human beings create. It's incredibly important because it has big implications on morality. When we look around at the world, do we get to decide what the world is for? Or can we pollute it and misshape it and twist it according to our own wisdom, according to our own preferences? And the answer is no. Think of, for an instance, if a child gives you this beautiful picture that they've drawn, and you take it, and you get scissors, and you cut it up, and you move it around, and then you give it back to the child and say, now this is something worthy of my time. Well, that's very insulting to that child. Now imagine God has created everything in the universe, because he has, and he's designated it for certain purposes, good purposes, his loving purposes. And we take that and we determine for ourselves what we're going to do with it and define for ourselves what's right and what's wrong to do with it because we reject God's design and God's order. And then we hand that back to him and say, this is better. At the end of the day, we're wrong that it's better because it isn't paradise that we're creating. But also we insult God, who has beautifully created everything and created it very good. So God bless you. Next week we're going to turn into examining theological anthropology, taking on these four causes of Aristotle and applying them to the human person. Take care.